Just have to make sure it's working. Right.
Sebastian.
Well, while we're waiting for technical difficulties to be resolved, at the end I'll tell you, if we have time, how I stumbled upon General Rosecrans' story. He was born in Delaware County, Ohio, that's north of Columbus, and he graduated 5th in the West Point class of 1842. So he was a smart guy. Went to the engineering corps, he did a lot of work of fortifications and along various forts on the coast. Not in the Mexican War. And, yeah, okay, right. So not in the Mexican War. And he resigned from the Army. Did everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
He resigned from the Army in the 1850s to go into private business. And he got to the oil refining business from coal. I don't really understand all these things, but he invented a type of lantern here, as you can see. So the point is, he was a smart guy. He settled in Cincinnati, and there was an explosion in his laboratory, and it burned. And if you look at a lot of his pictures, he has like the little smirk in his ears. People always comment. When the war breaks out in 1861, he offers his services to Governor Dennison of Ohio. He goes to Washington to also try to get some supplies, but he gets offered a position in the Army. And where does he end up? He ends up in West Virginia. There you go. Now we're going to have to retire you after about 5 questions. But if anybody has an answer, shout them out. It's more fun. He ends up in West Virginia. Now, have any of you been to Richmond Mountain, Carnifex Ferry? Okay. So, we have a pointer too. So this is where. Uh-oh. What did I do wrong?
It snowed.
Turns out.
Turn it off. Okay. So if you know where Wheeling is, they came into Western Virginia to. Maybe I'm not going to do the pointer. That seems to be what cost it. So
Sure, pointer should be fine. It doesn't do that.
okay. There we go. No.
Are you getting more than one button?
Okay. Yeah, the pointer's not a good thing.
What is that good?
Okay.
And that's one.
Okay. So, and we don't need to talk a whole lot about West Virginia, except to mention the following: that they began up here. You can see the blue, and if you look carefully, that says McClellan, because Rosecrans was under McClellan. In a lot of books, McClellan is the Union hero of all this. So McClellan was not in West Virginia very long, because after the Battle of Rich Mountain, which was July of 11th, 1861, where does McClellan go? He's summoned to Washington to take over the Army of the Potomac after the first Bull Run. So then Rosecrans is in West Virginia. He's in command. There's a battle, Carnifex Ferry. The Confederates actually lost less than the Union Army did, but they retreated. And then right in this area here is the area of Sewell Mountain, where Rosecrans is facing none other than Robert E. And there's no battle there, but Lee is hoping that Rosecrans will do something rash like attacking, and then his army will be destroyed. Rosecrans doesn't do that. Lee retreats, and all of this area is in Union hands. So the next time someone says the reason West Virginia is a separate state is because people didn't like slavery and they voted, well, it also helped that the Union Army occupied that land. And for those of you that haven't been to West Virginia, that's what the terrain really looks like. So no one ever fought in the terrain that Rosecrans did. Rosecrans is replaced as commander in the Mountain Division. I think they call it. Who is it replaced by?
Fremont.
Fremont. Very good. Now, why is this important? Well, Fremont was the first candidate of the Republican Party, right, in 1856. So he's always a darling of the radical element of the party. What did Fremont do in 1861? He issued an Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody's in Missouri. You can't be doing that. So what happens is, I think, it's not an illogical thing to think that if the war was going to be a short war, which they hoped for in 1861, why not get one of our guys well positioned so that maybe he will be the hero? You don't have to accept that, but it is interesting that Rosecrans is successful and he is replaced. And where does he end up? He ends up, oh, we got a quote for you here, actually. This was actually written in 1900s or so. Rosecrans, not McClellan, was the hero of Rich Mountain, which battle was decisive for the campaign in West Virginia in 1861, which defeated and discredited Lee and cleared the field for the restoration of civil government in Virginia. So if Rosecrans had done nothing else but that, he would be a minor, but an important figure. But he ends up in, Rosecrans ambulance. Remember I said he was a smart guy. So he designed the type of ambulance, the wheeling of Rosecrans ambulance. This is where he ends up. He ends up in northeastern Mississippi. Okay, had many of you been to Corinth, all right? How many have been to you? Probably very good. I'm impressed. Okay, for those that haven't, this was to be a pincer movement. I dare not use the pointer, so I'll use the old-fashioned pointer. Rosecrans was to come in from the south, Grant and Ord from the north. They would squeeze Price, and there would be a great victory. What happens is that Grant and Ord do not participate in the battle. Now, if you read most histories, they will say that was because there was an acoustical shadow that carried the sound of battle away. That's why Grant didn't participate. Most of you probably heard that, right? But here's what someone wrote. This was published in the Rock Island Argus newspaper, Rock Island, Illinois, on October 28, 1862. Let's go right to the bold part. We rested there one day and started for Boonesville, Mississippi, from which place we marched towards Iuka. There we arrived just in time to hear the parting guns of Price's army and had to go back without seeing the enemy, to the disgust of every man in the army. Why we were not permitted to participate in this battle and destroy perhaps the whole of Price's forces when we were in striking distance is a matter yet unexplained. Yet we had to go back without firing a gun, and the cursing and swearing of the soldier was heard all along the road. We're not being permitted to have a hand in the fight and help the gallant Rosecrans, who had engaged the enemy and was doing his best, but could not keep back the whole of Price's forces, as his own was not strong enough. Now this is printed less than 2 months after the battle. This is someone that heard the sound of the battle. You know, I'm often accused of being overly praising of Rosecrans, but I didn't say the gallant Rosecrans, the man that wrote this.
Yeah, you quote.
This is from a letter of Thomas Christie, the Minnesota regiment. Let's look at the last part. Here we stay until evening, hearing the brick cannonading to the right, where Rosecrans, I do see until. Rosecrans, his name is spelled so many different ways, is pushing them in. Is there nothing for us to do? This is a letter written on. So evidently some people heard. Iuka is important because it is the beginning of the rift between Grant and Rosecrans. And we know who won them, right? We know who's on the $50 bill. We know who's got parks all across the country named for the counties. Then comes Corinth. And Corinth, Mississippi is fought October 3rd and 4th. The Confederates in red there are storming the fortifications. They even get into the heart of this town of Corinth, the railroad crossing, and you should know that Corinth actually was the important objective for the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh was a church at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. Corinth is where they really wanted railroad crossroads. Then they are repulsed by the Confederates, and Rosecrans has the temerity to rest his troops after fighting for 2 days, and then pursue the next day. You'll read many histories and they'll say, why didn't he pursue? Fewer people ask, where was Ulysses S. Grant? This is from Sherman's memoirs. You have to be careful with memoirs, but Sherman would have no reason to embellish this. The effect of the Battle of Corinth was very great. It was indeed a decisive blow to the Confederate cause in our quarter and changed the whole aspect of affairs in West Tennessee. From the timid offensive, we were at once enabled to assume the bold offensive. In Memphis, the citizens openly admitted that their cause was sustained indefinitely. Well, the situation between Rosecrans and Grant is not good, and Rosecrans asked to be removed from Grant's command. And he ends up in, oh, excuse me, I always forget this good one. And we're right in the place because you should know who these people are. Sorry. This is from Joseph Medill. You all know Joseph Medill? I don't have to say the Chicago Tribune, I can say the editor of the Tribune, right? He wrote, L.U. Washburn, When do you think the Union is going to be saved out west? I write to you because it is through your influence mainly that Grant holds the trust which he thus betrays. No man's military career in the Army is more open to destructive criticism than Grant's. We have kept off of him on your account. We could have made him stink in the nostrils of the public like an old fish had we properly criticized his military blunders. Look at that miserable and costly campaign in northern Mississippi when he sent crazy Sherman to Vicksburg and agreed to meet him there by land. Was there ever a more weak and imbecile campaign? But we forbore exposing him in the examination. Now, again, I didn't write this. Joseph Medill wrote this. I'm sparing you what C.C. Washburn, his brother, wrote to me. You can see that on your own. But let's analyze this a little bit more. These are both on the same side. They both are not only want the Union to win, they're both Republicans. But Joseph Medill has no real interest in who emerges as the leading general. He wants to get the war won. Eliot Washburn of Galena, Illinois, the man who really created Grant and sustained it after Shiloh and after the problems in northeastern Mississippi, does have an interest in doing so. So I think that's very important to notice. So where does Rosecrans end up? He ends up in Middle Tennessee. Takes over the army, well, not Middle Tennessee, but takes over the army in Cumberland. And they fight December 31st and January 1st, January 2nd, the Battle of Murfreesboro, Stones River. And I'm assuming a lot of you have been to Stones River, right? And you see that big arrow thrusting there. The right wing of the Union Army was surprised, and the Confederates come across, and then the question is, will they be able to get in the rear of the Union Army and take the pike there, the Nashville pike, and then cut off his line of retreat, Rosecrans' line of retreat. And in case you didn't know, he didn't. They weren't able to do that. Rosecrans and others helped rebuild the line. Let's see what some people said that were there. Now, I've been doing some research. So this is from the 15th Wisconsin, which was known as the Scandinavian Regiment. They translated the book. And it says right there, Rosecrans himself took command of this position and held it as long as the battle lasted. And it was said that it was his personal courage and ability to which the Army owed its salvation. This, I just did this today. This is from the Chicago Board of Trade Biography. To the left and front lay the key to the position. Not to hold the gap would be fatal. At this juncture, Major General Rosecrans dashed from left to right and discovered the Chicago Board of Trade battery ready for the fray without positive directions. His orders were given to officers and men indiscriminately as the case demanded. He spurred back to near gap, returned part way, beckoned and shouted, "Right this way." His on parade, the command of the trot came into battery in the gap on the crest, and so the general on the right line. So this was written after, of course. But the point is, people are remembering the presence of Rosecrans here. You often read that Rosecrans got nervous in battle and he stammered. I'd really like to see the documentation for that. Another interesting thing about Rosecrans is that he really did care about his soldiers. I don't think I brought it, but I found a letter just the other day. It was written by a fellow, and he said Rosecrans was the soldier's friend. The soldier's friend. So this is from that same thing about the Chicago Board of Trade battery. After the Battle of Stone River, which is the real name of the battle, General Rosecrans, commanding the Army of the Cumberland, issued a special order giving the battery the privilege of carrying the colors presented by the Chicago Board of Trade. This being the first time in the history of the Army where a battery of artillery was allowed to stand with the United States colors in a battery flag. By a subsequent special order, Stone River, Elk River, Chickamauga, go with that. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but the point is that they thought it was true, that it was the first. I know that this happened, but that it was the first, I don't know. So Rosecrans was a man that believed in rewarding and complimenting the people that fought. I was talking with you about the blockade that was in reference to this. This is from a Confederate position perspective. Events had made Murfreesboro, Stones River, saying that, the hinge upon which the fortunes of the Confederacy must turn. That battle won by the Confederates, the paper blockade, we're talking about the blockade, would be torn to tatters and the independence of the Confederacy assured. On that field, the genius of Rosecrans turned the paper blockade would have happened. On that field, his genius destroyed the Confederacy and established the Union. You don't have to believe that. But the point is that someone said that. The Confederates said that. He later became governor of Tennessee, lost his leg in Stones River. Stones River, you know, a lot of people don't even know about it.
Yeah, amazing.
I can never forget, whilst I remember anything, that about the end of last year, the beginning of this, you gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely live with it. Now, if you ask somebody, who said this to whom about what battle, they probably wouldn't say, oh, that's easy, Abraham Lincoln, William S. Rosecrans, Stones River. They would never know. But let's go a little bit deeper into this. December 31st is the first day. What is Lincoln going to do on January 1st? And of course, today we see that as one of the great things of the war. At the time, it was seen as a desperation. What type of December had Lincoln had? Not just Fredericksburg, which everybody knows. How about Holly Springs, where where Grant's supply depot was destroyed? Now we know because of Gideon Wells's diary that Lincoln had a dream the night of December 31st. You know, had that reoccurring dream. We know this because Gideon Wells puts in his diary for April 14th, 1865. There was a cabinet meeting, and Lincoln says, you know, paraphrasing of course, I had that dream that I had several times during the war. It usually came before victory, it portended something important, usually a victory. And he thought, Lincoln thought, that this was going to be word that Sherman had, that was going to capture Johnston. Well, we know, interestingly enough, it did portend something. It portended the death of him. In that cabinet meeting, he said that I had that dream before Murfreesboro. So that's the point I want to make, that even on the last day of his life, his conscious life, he still remembered the importance of Murfreesboro. You'll often read that he did, well, Rosecrans, after this battle, was probably the leading Union general. Not a lot of people had marches, but had the Rosecrans victory march. It started a roll of honor, and he actually, we would have the various regiments select people that were merited distinction, and he actually wanted to mount them on horses, mounted infantry, which he did for different mounted infantry. He never got that far, but he was always concerned about his soldiers. Now, you'll often read that he did nothing for 6 months, and that's not the case. Among the things he did, he built Fortress Rosecrans, the Civil War's largest fortress like no other, largest earthen fort during the war. Okay, he was expert in logistics and transportation. Look where he was going. There's no river. There's not going to be any help from the Navy. He's on a rail line, going deeper and deeper, not just into Confederate territory, but hillier and mountainous territory.
Most of that still exists.
Fortress Rosecrans? Well, there's a golf course there.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the perimeter is still going.
Parts of it, yeah. And so, you know, Rosecrans was going in an area where no one in the world really went into. I mean, it's such a difficult terrain. People, if you haven't, this is what I want to say, if you haven't been in that area, you really can't appreciate what the difficulties were everybody accomplished. I'll just mention one thing. He was very advanced in cartography, and they had a system where they went and took pictures of the landscape. They developed those pictures, and then they would update their maps. And if you look at, I don't know where I got this source from, but someone went to Sherman when he took over the army and they said to him, well, what about your maps? And he said, maps? You know, maybe it's not maps, but where's your department that controls all your maps? So he didn't do nothing for 6 months. And if you don't believe me, get Dave Powell come talk to you. So then he does the Tullahoma campaign. And what he does here is he uses deception, threatening from one direction, but then attacking from another. But he also uses technology, specifically the Spencer repeating rifle. And this, of course, is the Lightning Brigade. John Wilder goes to Rosecrans and says, you know, there's these new weapons. The War Department didn't seem to be particularly interested in this. So they work out something where they will buy these rifles and then deduct the money from the soldiers' pay for it. And the Battle of Hoover's Gap, which Interstate 24 runs through now, but there's a little shelter on the side, you can go look at it. That is said to be the first battle where revolving weapon. That's another view. Now this ended first week of July. Anything else going on during the Civil War during the first week of July? Well, I don't know if you've ever had Michael Bradley speak to you, but he's one of the few that have actually written on Tullahoma. Again, another thing that historians don't seem to be convinced of. Here's his conclusion: Grant did achieve a victory which had important psychological and public relations dimensions, and since the usual goal of the grand strategy at the time was the destruction of the opposing army, Grant fulfilled that goal, but the Confederacy arguably could have survived the fall of Vicksburg and still won the war. It did survive for 2 more years. Meade won a defensive victory at Gettysburg. This boosted morale, it's misspelled too, sorry, especially for the Army of the Potomac, which had never known such a clear-cut win. But defensive victories would not win the war. Lee won defensive victories almost every week during 1864 and still wound up in Appomattox. If the Atlanta campaign of 1864 had begun in the vicinity of Murfreesboro, would Atlanta have been taken before the November election? Would Lincoln have received a second term? That's a really good question. Because it's hard to get to Chattanooga, as we're going to see in a minute. It took him a long time from May to the end of August just to go from Chattanooga to Atlanta. What happens if you had to get to Chattanooga first? Edwin Stanton. He said this to Rosecrans. We have just received official information that Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant on the 4th of July. Lee's army overthrown, Grant victorious. You and your noble army have the chance to give the finishing blow to the rebellion. You neglect the chance. Rosecrans was a person with strong opinions. We could say so that didn't suffer fools gladly, easily, and right there in the center. I beg in behalf of this army that the War Department may not overlook so great an event, the clearing of the rebels from Middle Tennessee, because it is not written in letters of blood. I mean, this is the irony of being famous. Had there been a Battle of Tullahoma with 20,000 casualties in a Park Service place, people would say, oh yeah, he won the Battle of Tullahoma too, didn't he? But there wasn't. It was a campaign. Now you do eventually have to get that army, and where does Bragg end up? He ends up in Chattanooga. Okay, some asides here. Each one of these people is worth a talk of their own. James Garfield. Now James Garfield is an interesting fellow. He was Rosecrans' chief of staff. He had been elected to Congress, but in those days you could be elected months before you took your seat. And that's what happened. And he goes down and he probably wants to be involved in a battle, so that will look good on his resume when he's running for office. And he and Rosecrans hit it off. And one reason they hit it off is that they had a shared interest in theology. Theology, right? Because Rosecrans was a Catholic convert, and so he had studied religion. And Garfield was a lay minister in the Disciples of Christ, the Christian church. So he was, he knew more about the history of religion and theology than the average person. Well, Rosecrans loved this. They would sit and talk about these things. Garfield did a couple of things. One thing he did was he sent a letter to Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, where he laments that Rosecrans is not moving fast enough. Well, you're not supposed to do that, much less discussing whether he was right. So later we're going to see a quote from Garfield. Keep in mind that Garfield always knew in the back of his mind that there was a letter out there that he never knew was going to get clearance. What also happened in 1863 is that Horace Greeley sent an emissary to Rosecrans to sound him out about running for president. And he said absolutely no. So keep that in mind too. So a lot happened in that summer of 1863. That's Chattanooga, in case you hadn't been. So what could the Union Army do? Well, it could go approach Chattanooga from the north, thus moving away from its supply line, the railroad. That's kind of stupid. It could follow the Tennessee River right through all those mountains and have another Thermopylae, for those of you that know your Greek history. That's kind of stupid. So what can you do? Well, what he did do, I don't know. And here you can see the maneuverings. And if you go to Chickamauga, you can't just go to the battlefield. You got to go to where the river is and look at the river crossings in Stevenson, Alabama, and Bridgeport. You've got to look at the whole big picture. And you have to go down to Chickamauga, Georgia, Crawfish Springs, and see how they ended up at the battle. What Rosecrans did was he sent Crittenden's corps to the north to make Bragg think that that's where the main thrust was coming. And then he sent 2 other corps, Thomas and McCook, across Lookout Mountain, the caps there. Now this is important because it's often said that Rosecrans, after being cautious for so long, then threw caution to the wind and wildly and widely divided his army. But he had to divide his army. Now there's a lot of misinformation and bad stuff here. You know, they didn't know until a few days before the battle that Bragg was being reinforced. The War Department didn't even though there was information on that on the front page of the New York Herald. No, it's unbelievable. So now what becomes the question, when all of this, not the question, but becomes the issue, is will the Union Army, will Rosecrans be able to unite his army and defend Chattanooga before the Confederates, who are now larger than he is, can cut him off? Everybody understand that? Right? Here's Chattanooga. This is the area near the battlefield. Can he get all these people together before Bragg can outflank him? Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the Battle of Chickamauga because that's a whole talk in itself. We'll talk about him in a minute. But I will say this. I think the most famous parts of Chickamauga, a lot of them really are on very shaky documentation grounds. For example, the dressing down of General Wood by Rosecrans. There's really only one source for that. It's Henry Siss's book, The Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans actually kind of promoted that later after the war, but there's not really a whole lot of evidence about that. Certainly nothing dramatic. Someone holding up the order and say, "I hold in my hand the fatal order." Well, I mean, you're going to risk everybody's life out of spite? Don't know about that. A big thing is, did he flee the battlefield in panic? No, that's a good one. Well, what's the sourcing? Well, a lot of the sourcing comes from Charles A. Down, a lot of the negative sourcing about the war coming from Charles A. Down. Are you familiar with him? Assistant Secretary of War, but generally considered to be a spy for the War Department. He'd been down to spy on Grant, now he's spying on Rosecrans. What actually did happen was after the right fell apart, right? Let's say that's the door to Chattanooga. Thomas is over here, and remember Thomas is usually in the center, but Rosecrans had moved Thomas, who he considered his best corps commander, to the left to guard the road. And what does Thomas say on the night of the 19th? I'd strengthen the left. I'd strengthen the left. And they said, what would you do? So we're going to take it from the right and put him on the left. But what's going to happen to the right? It's going to be weakened. How about the famous gap? Well, that played a role, but a lot of new research says that the Union right would have been flanked anyhow. They just ran out of it. Rosecrans and Garfield meet up. And there's 2 versions about what happened. Rosecrans' version is that he said to Garfield, why don't you go to Chattanooga and do all these things? And I'll go see what's happening with Thomas here. And Garfield said, oh, I can't do that. Why don't you do that? And I'll go. And the other version is that Rosecrans said, I think it's lost. I'm going to go to Chattanooga. And Garfield said, this is Garfield's version. Well, I think there may still be hope. I'm going to go see Thomas. So those are the 2 versions. But nobody says that he fled the battlefield in panic.
So who's in command there?
Yeah.
Who's in command?
I mean, wouldn't you think that that Rosecrans would give him an order to do one or the other?
Well, what would happen? That's a good question that maybe we should say it to the end. But let me ask you this. What was the Battle of Chickamauga fought for ultimately? Was it fought for that creek or was it fought for the city of Chattanooga? And this is an important thing. There's a misconception that the Union Army had Chattanooga and then marched out. They never did. Crittenden passed through, left behind some men, and then went to pursue Bragg. So they didn't really have much in the way of presence in Chattanooga. So Chattanooga is the prize, according to this school of thought. And that's more important than the creek. Okay? So I guess Rosecrans, if he really felt his army was destroyed, and remember, he's now hearing that Longstreet's there. He's hearing that parole prisoners from Vicksburg are there. He has no idea that the whole Confederate Army's not there, that Lee's not there. I mean, what do? You have to assume the worst case scenario. I think that's what he would say. But he probably, in retrospect, probably wished he'd gone to the front, but But what is more important? To be killed there on Snodgrass Hill, or to make sure that you're starting? Remember, the army, the right wing had broken. They were streaming back anyhow. So should you try to put some order to that? But let's look at some quotes here. This is from the bottom part. This was a letter that was in the Milwaukee paper in November of 1863. The allegation abroad in some circles that Rosecrans had actually abandoned his army that Sunday at Chickamauga vexed many soldiers. Quote, reports in the papers about Rosecrans' pure lies, stressed a Republican officer whose letter was published in the Milwaukee paper. He wrote that he had seen the general when the 24th Wisconsin fell back. Rosecrans was riding around trying to rally our men, and the bullets were flying around him like hail. As the Milwaukee officer passed, Rosecrans waved his hat, shouting above the din, halt, boys, rally and make one charge for me. If any man told the writer Rosie had quit the field, quote, I would whip him if he did not weigh over 300. Confound their lying faces. They ought to be shot. Okay. This is from the Norwegian regiment. General Rosecrans, this is after Chickamauga. This is, I think, the 22nd or 23rd, when, of course, he's supposed to be despondent, broken. So General Rosecrans rode along the line almost every evening and always had a friendly word for everyone. When he approached, he evoked loud ringing cheers that resounded toward Lookout Mountain and other places occupied by the rebels. But how about Charles A. Downe? This is what he sent in his second telegram to Washington on the second day of Chickamauga. I am happy to report that my dispatch at 4 p.m. today proves to have given too dark a view of our disaster. That's the one that says Chickamauga is as bad a name in our history as Bull Run. Having then myself swept bodily off the battlefield by the panic-struck rabble into which the divisions of Davis and Sheridan were temporarily converted, my own impressions were naturally colored by the aspect of that part of the field. It appears, however, that only those two divisions were actually routed, that Thomas, with the remainder of the army, still holds as part of the strengthened by the addition of that portion of the reserve lately stationed at Rossville under Granger. Granger's actually one of the heroes of Chickamauga. But here's the, I think, Downe concluded, some gentlemen of Rosecrans' staff said Chickamauga is not very much worse than was Murfreesboro. I can testify to the conspicuous and steady gallantry of Rosecrans on the field. He made all possible efforts to rally the broken columns, nor do I see that there was any fault in the disposition of his forces. Now you have to be careful with Charles A. Downe, because he's not a good witness. I'm sorry, okay? But I would say if it was ever going to be honest, it was going to be on the night of the battle, when truth was paramount. Now the tone of his dispatches begins to change after this. And a quote you may have heard, Lincoln said Rosecrans is stunned like a duck hit on the head. Well, how would Lincoln know? I mean, Lincoln didn't go visit Rosecrans. He would know only from these dispatches coming from Downe. Downe, in the 1880s, when this was all beginning to come out, would later write Rosecrans and say, you would probably find some of the things that I was misinformed in some of the things I wrote, and maybe even unfair. Okay. Was he stunned like a duck hit on the head? Well, how about the opening of this cracker? Who did that? Nobody says Grant anymore. But a lot of people, most people say General W.F. Baldy Smith. Rosecrans died in 1898. Smith outlived him. So Smith kept pressing this. And he went to the War Department. And the War Department looked into it. And they, after diligent search of the official records, the board failed to find any evidence, that General W.F. Smith was the originator of the plan for Chattanooga. On the contrary, there is abundant evidence in the official records to show that the plan, which contemplated crossings of the Tennessee River at Bridgeport, the northern end of Lookout Valley, which was successfully executed by General Thomas, was devised and prepared for by General Rosecrans. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, who knows this? I'm going to spare you the one from LeDuc, who was the guy that piloted the first ship, and he looks at, I think it's Richard Johnson's memoirs, and Richard Johnson sent it to him, and he writes back to Richard Johnson and said, you praise me too much, you need to give more praise to Rosecrans in here. Who does that? It's in the book. So, if he wasn't stunned like the duck hit on the head, and he was getting ready to open the cracker line, why was he removed? Well, that's a good question. A quote that a lot of people don't know that Lincoln wrote, was, "I must do something for General Rosecrans." And what does he do? He sends him to Missouri. Okay? That was a real mess. Right? And, you know, I'm not really an expert on this, but I think he did pretty well. You know? It was a tough situation. He had to have militia. But this is what, you know, Stephen Z. Starr wrote many years ago. Except for the operations long past the end of the war of guerrillas, gangs, or individuals professing to be laboring for the Confederacy, the Civil War west of the Mississippi came effectively to an end when Price crossed the Arkansas River on November 7, 1864. Now, Rosecrans thought this was going to get him back in good graces in Washington for long. And in fact, he was relieved for the fourth and final time after. He retires from the Army in 1867. And John Russell Young, who's the editor of the New York Tribune, he writes to Garfield and he says, "I see that Rosecrans' resignation has been accepted at last, and that he's to go out of the Army. I wish you would sit down before you leave Washington and give me a memorandum of his military career. How he was removed 4 times, each time at the end of a victory." Now this isn't interesting, because Chattanooga, Chickamauga seen as a victory. Am I saying that? No, a man that lived that. So, see, that goes to that whole thing. What was the objective of the Chickamauga campaign? You know, and if you ever get, you know, Dave, what's his last name? Yeah, down here, you know, I asked him online, I've never met him personally, wasn't there going to be a battle for Chattanooga? Was Longstreet sent to Tennessee to engage in a siege through the fall and winter? Absolutely not. He was sent there to fight a battle, don't you think so? And assuming that no army is going to destroy another army, what are you going to have? You're going to have 2 wounded armies, and one of them's going to have Chattanooga. Well, in a sense, that's kind of what you have. Hello. But Garfield wrote that. Yours of yesterday came to hand this morning, and I have made a few notes of dates and events in the career of General Rosecrans, which may aid you. I am glad it is in your heart to notice his exit from the Army in a way that will recognize the service he rendered to the nation when it needed friends. For nearly a year, my relations with him were so intimate we scarcely had a separate thought on any question affecting the great contest. If the President-makers had let him alone, he might have been at the head of our armies today. But in the fatal summer of 1863, he was enveloped in clouds of incense, and visions of the presidency were constantly thrust before him. I think it was really just that one time. I think that this made him a little overcautious and increased the delay in the beginning of the campaign in Middle Tennessee. Now, see, he's covering himself because he knows that he's written letters saying that. So getting back to the Middle Tennessee campaign, which though brilliant and successful, came so late as to be somewhat obscured by the achievement of Grant's army at Vicksburg and the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg. Well, today it's unknown. You know, he could say in the 1860s, well, it's somewhat obscured. Today we can say it's almost totally eclipsed, right? I think also that the political leaders became alarmed at his increasing fame and were not unwilling to see evil befall. Certain it is that the War Department seemed very ready to find fault with him from that time forward. I have never before put these thoughts on paper and rarely spoken them to my dearest friends. The events are too recent to make it prudent. The time may come when they will be. That's pretty tough stuff. But I think the question about Chickamauga is, why wasn't Rosecrans reinforced before the battle? What was Sherman doing in August of 1863? We can even say, what was Grant doing? Let's just stay with Sherman. Why wasn't he reinforced? A lot of people ask that question. You know this fellow? This is maybe the most important unknown person in the Civil War. Because it seems to me without him, none of us would know Ulysses S. Grant. He was from Galena, Illinois. I haven't been to Galena. I probably have to wear a mask when I go in there or something. And of course, Grant's living through it. Dear sir, on looking about among the politicians here, guess where here is? Dear old Chicago. I find that there is more activity here than elsewhere in reference to prospective politics. Honorable E.B. Washburne is making a business already of committing men to Grant for the presidency. He is wealthy, shrewd, earnest, determined that Grant shall be the man. I hear good men say he will go to a nominating convention stronger than Lincoln. They are trying to get Grant in command of Rosecrans' army, his own too, perhaps additional reinforcements. Send him across to the Atlantic and eastward on Richmond, hoping thereby to make him irresistible in a nominating convention. If the administration see the joke, they will see to it that he does not get an opportunity. But if Grant and his Western friends can do this thing, they will. Now, you're scoffing, but this is what J.K. Herbert, his italics. I am not misinformed. They are bending every energy for the enterprise. He wrote this to Butler. Benjamin Butler was like kind of a comic character to us today. But people don't understand how much appeal he had to the radicals because of, among other things, the contraband war issue of Fort Monroe, which you're going to, but in 2 years, right? So you'll learn all about that. I was telling Robert here, I know nothing about J.K. Herbert except that he actually existed. He got involved in comic speculation. There's actually a Supreme Court case with his name, but I found no death records for him. If you ever find J.K. Herbert, real name Jasper Gay, you let me know, okay? Well, what can I say about this? I mean, this was written August 16th. Henry Van Ness Point, soldier, Medal of Honor recipient, journalist, historian, first superintendent of Chickamauga Battlefield Park, and staunch defender of Rosecrans. Thomas is another victim, and the Army of the Cumberland. Okay, now this is the one, we're not going to read the whole thing, because some of you Grant people might say, I don't know. Okay. So we'll just, Don Piatt, didn't even know Don Piatt? P-I-A-T-T. Yeah. He was a soldier for a while, he was a journalist after his new biography about him called Gilded Age Gadfly, which is a terrible title, because he wasn't a gadfly, he was a serious person. He was known as a man who took on the lobbies. There actually were lobbies in the 19th century. So in his biography of Thomas is this, and we're not going to read all the terrible stuff. Of all the generals who achieved notoriety during the Civil War, he, Grant, is the one whose career as a soldier will bear the least scrutiny. It is strange, dropping down, that so unsuccessful a general should be able to retain the confidence of the war in Washington. That all that must have been known of his blunders, there's that word people don't like to hear, habits. There is a solution to this mystery found in the name of career of L.U. Benjamin Washburn. So this is a man who was there, saying, oh yeah, it's Washburn. That's all too terrible. Okay. So Rosecrans, what does he do after the war? Well, he's ambassador to Mexico. It's called Minister of Mexico. And for a while until Ulysses S. Grant becomes president. And then that's the end of that. Now when I speak to Southern groups, I highlight this picture. This is Rosecrans there with Robert E. Lee. And this is in the Virginia room of the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. And what this depicts, and this is the 20th century, is Rosecrans seeking out the Confederate leaders who met there in the summer to escape the heat. And he said, will you sign this manifesto saying that the leaders of the South accept the outcome of the war and the abolition of slavery? Because the opposing party is going to say that if you vote for the Democratic Party, which was largely a Southern-based party at the time, they will try to undo the things for war. And so he signed it. So that's what this represents. What else did he? He tried to make his fortune in mining. He was actually away from his family an awful lot. It's kind of sad to read those letters. I think that he just did wait. Let's say that he believed at least as much as I did about it, right? And he says, nobody, I can't believe this is happening. I think that would impress some people. And he never struck it rich. He was registrar of the Treasury for a while, but he had to wait for a Democratic administration. That doesn't happen here, right? When you change administrations. No. See, that's really no. So he was that for a while, and then he got elected 2 terms of Congress from California, first congressional district, because he settled in California, and he lived until 1898. Died. There's an old age. This is a statue of General Thomas in Washington, Thomas Circle, and that church is a 20th century successor to the church that Garfield went to There's actually a stained glass window of Garfield in that church. Any presidential trivia people? Who was the other disciples of Vice President?
Lyndon Johnson.
There he is. Excellent. Very good. So they've got stained glass windows of both. I was a lad once, and Lyndon Johnson, at the height of his difficulties, was walking down the steps, and a handful of people saw him, and they kind of just applauded. That's in the days when you always applaud the president. The idea that a president could walk down the steps with a minimal security is just tells you what different age it was. So, how did I stumble upon this? Well, I went to Mount Olivet Cemetery, which is an old cemetery in Washington. I was looking for Mary Surratt's grave. But I'd seen it before. There was a bronze plaque on the back of it that someone put on there, basically blaming Edwin Stanton for all of her problems. I couldn't find it. And I was with my friend, and we stumbled upon this. And I said, oh, wife of General, it says analyze Rosecrans, wife of General Rosecrans. I said, you know, he wasn't a very good general. And then I said, I wonder where he's buried. And he was buried in Arlington Cemetery. And this is back in the pre-internet days. There used to not be the internet. So you had to hope that there was a book. Remember books, how great they were? You had to hope there were books printed on something. So there was a book on Arlington Cemetery. And in that book it said, except for a strange quirk of fate, William S. Rosecrans would have been the 17th president of the United States. So, what? And it said that Abraham Lincoln offered him the vice presidency in 1864. He accepted it, but Edwin Stanton intercepted it, and all the telegrams didn't go to Stanton's office. And so it didn't get it in time. I said, well, this is unbelievable, especially considering his religious background. I said, well, maybe the National Enquirer would be interested in this story. Well, how can we find out more about these people? Well, a man named William Lammers, as they say in Wisconsin, wrote a book called The Edge of Glory. And it came out in 1961. He was superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools in the 50s, probably the Milwaukee Public Schools were one of the finest in the country. And it came out, got good reviews, and was forgotten. Okay? But without that book, little old me wouldn't have known where to go. So I have a great debt to William Lammers. It was out of print for a while, but it has been reissued. There he is, buried in Arlington. He died in Los Angeles in 1898, and then was reburied in Arlington in 1903. That's all it says is Major General William Stark Rosecrans, and on the other side just says Rosecrans. If you stumble upon that, you wouldn't know anything about it. So, what about other people that have looked at this? Well, here's Boynton's book. He wrote many articles as well. This is Sherman's Historical Raid, the memoirs and the light of the record. The man who should have been speaking to you here is Albert Costello. We'll talk about him in a moment. And he wrote a book, of course, many years ago called Decision in the West about the Atlantic Campaign. And he also has a book about essays on the Civil War. What is that? Winning and Losing the Civil War. And one of the essays is Prevaricating Through Georgia. Okay. There's Lammers' book. I understand Frank Varney has or hasn't spoken. Yes. So, Frank Varney, General Grant, the rewriting of history. Basically, his thesis is that people just accept the memoirs. They just, and when we say people, we mean scholars, academics. They accept to the memoirs, it's probably true. This was a cover story of Civil War Times magazine, illustrated, we used to call it. I didn't say that. That is actually an essay by Evan Jones that comes from a chapter in this book. More and more people are looking and saying, oh, it was the Western. Illinois is really a Western state. You know that by 19th century standards. They're saying Chattanooga is important, and the Western theater is important. So he has an essay, does Evan Jones, on the Rosecrans Grant split that started in northeastern Mississippi, and guess who he thinks was right? Okay. Dave Powell has an essay in that about the 6 months of inactivity and how Rosecrans built this great, this new army. Looking for something to do? Got 800 pages? I think you've helped with this, right? Or a little bit. So Joseph Rose, an amateur, got interested in Grant and started reading it. You know, he sent it to a number of people, including yourself and Gordon Gray, and they said, well, there's some interesting stuff in here. So I think it's interesting, a lot of amateur historians are like saying, wow, this isn't what. Victors in Blue, Albert Castell's last book. Albert Castell, as I said, is the man that should be here speaking. But as happens with all this, the clock ran out. Life is like football or baseball. You can't play 120 innings if you keep time, right? Eventually the guns. In one of his last chapters, he says, I shall say no more, but to state the wish and deem the desire that some other historian other than himself, one young, talented, and courageous, would produce a biography of Rosecrans. Now, why do you have to say courageous? We're not living in Soviet. You know? Because perhaps it upsets our whole understanding. Now, what makes this doubly interesting is that the man that helped him finish the book is the leading Grant scholar, Brooks Simpson. And I sent an email to Brooks Simpson, and, you know, a little humble me, not humble, a little uncredentialed me. And I said, you know, no one's better positioned than you to be that person. He said, well, it's really Alan's book. And, you know, he has every right to do that. But I'm just wondering, he said, you know, I don't want to start with the Grant Rosecrans. I don't know. If he were here, he'd say that, stop that speculation. Rosecrans had no statue anywhere. In Cleveland, if you go to Cleveland, one of the things to see in downtown Cleveland is the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And been there. Yeah. And go inside, they've got all the officers borrow these sculptures. And there's old Rosecrans in the corner with his beard. But that was it. And then some citizens in his own township, Sunbury, Ohio, raised money, something out of it. You know, one of those great old uplifting movies. They raised the money and they dedicated this in September 23rd. So the next time that you're in Columbus, you have a reason to go to Sunbury. We didn't talk about Julius Garchet. That's another interesting story. He was killed the first day of Stones River. This is his grave at Mount Olive. I'm happy to say this isn't vandalism. This is a result of something called the derecho storm that hit the East Coast in 2012. I think it started here in the Midwest. Came across, very bizarre. Came out of nowhere. High winds and then the top of that. I asked the cemetery people and said, well, you know, next weekend I have to do something. But that's kind of sad. There she is, Mary Surratt. So I went back, I make a point of going to the cemetery, which is way off the beaten path several times. I said, you know, I went to the office and said, you know, I was here one time and there was a plaque on the back of her grave. And they said, oh, yes. I said, that was unauthorized by the family and they wanted it removed. So then I went to the Surratt not boarding house, but Surratt Tavern, not the one downtown Washington, but the one in Clinton, Maryland. I said, you know, I was at the cemetery and they told me this about the plaque. I said, oh yeah, we're the ones that did it. So the glass case over there. So that's the Surratt family doesn't. They don't try it. They don't make a case. You either know who she is or you don't. You either think she should have been executed or you don't. And that is the end of the story. Because, you know, one of my first talks, a gentleman older than myself came up to me and he said, you know, there's been a tendency to tear down our heroes. And I knew where he was coming from. And I don't totally disagree with you. But I said, you know, Rosecrans is a hero too. And the people that fought on it. So I'm not for taking down anybody's statue. Not even taking them off a $50 bill. You know? We have a new star in the first. And the irony is, if we were in Alabama or someplace, and I gave a talk on Braxton Bragg, and I said, you know, Braxton Bragg doesn't have a statue. 6 of you would jump and say, we're going to do something about that. Old Braxton fought for us. We're going to get it going. You don't know how many people in these chat rooms, a good thing to stay out of, by the way, are just adamant against commemorating Rosecrans. Why? Why would you be against someone, the men that fought under? I don't get that. Okay, any questions? What's that?
Why
Why?
did he get such a bad rap?
Oh, well, oh, I think he got, why does he have a bad rap today? Because of bad history.
None of it being true.
Well, meaning what? That he fled the battle and panic? Did he do that?
Why was he removed for it?
Politics,
I
I'd say.
mean,
I'd say
yeah.
politics. Okay, well, we could go through. He's replaced by John C. Fremont. We could say that's politics. He asked to be removed from under Grant because he fought 2 battles under Grant, northeastern Mississippi. Grant's not there. That would make you say, you know, I think we need to have that real. In fact, we need to go to different places. Now, Chickamauga is the one that you can say, well, you know, we lost the battle. Okay. But at the time, Chickamauga was seen as the campaign was successful. You'd be very surprised if you went and read these things. I think what people need to do is they need to get away from the standard histories and go a little bit deeper. Read these books that I mentioned, Generals, Victors in Blue. Okay? Read those things. And then Missouri. Well, then, you know, Grant wants to get rid of it. So I think it's politics, to be honest with you. Yes?
So was it just, you know, Republicans trying to protect their own?
In many ways,
and
yes.
not wanting to promote the career of anybody who's a Democrat?
I think there's that. And if has anybody delved into the Edmund Stanton biography that's come out, you know, Lincoln's autocrat, that's something you got to do 5 to 10 pages at a time. It's really deep. He basically makes that point, you know. And everybody knows that McClellan had political problems. If you look at Gideon Wells' diary, you know, he says that they brought John Pope, here to Washington to promote him over McClellan. Now let's put a good spin on this. You can say they were right, or at least you can understand them. You're going to 7 days, right? Next week, you know, well, you know, Gary Gallagher at the University of Virginia thinks that's the turning point of the Civil War. Because he said, and that enabled the war to be long enough for Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Let's say that McClellan had taken Richmond in 1862. Not impossible. You could say not likely, but not impossible. If he'd been given a gigantic army, he may have been able to do it. Well, what would have happened? Who would have been the next president of the United States? McClellan. You know, people wouldn't know who Abraham Lincoln is today. Because there would be no Gettysburg Address, there'd be no Second Inaugural Address, there'd be no Emancipation Proclamation. He'd be the answer to a trivia question. Who was the only Republican president, you know? Because the Republican Party would have gone out of business. It would have been an opposing party to the Democrats. Who knows what they're going to call themselves? The neo-Whigs or something. So you can say they were justified they could justify themselves. This is the war for emancipation. We need to remake the Union. McClernand, in many ways, is a victim too. You know,
By mid-1863 or late 1863, didn't Lincoln and Stanton and some of the other leaders kind of develop the perception that our generals were winning territory, losing territory, winning territory, and it wasn't get anywhere? That what they had to do was actually defeat Confederate armies. And the feeling was that the glorious campaign in Tennessee didn't particularly do that. And while Grant was not only taking Vicksburg, but actually capturing an army, and while Meade was not only winning a battle, but defeating an army, that wasn't happening in Tennessee.
Well, that's a standard thing. I would just say this. You know, after Vicksburg, you saw the quote by Michael Bradley. Well, what was really accomplished? What happened to most of those prisoners? They were paroled, right? What did Grant do after Vicksburg? Anybody know? He went to,
Stop the program.
Fell off the horse.
he fell off the horse in New Orleans, among other things. He went down to New Orleans, and you know, I don't like to bring up the drinking thing, because that really gets Grant Parsons angry. But it's there. It's there. You can look for it. Nathaniel Banks and some others reported they were drinking. But that's beside the point. Why? Now, Grant's not running the show. But why don't they do something with Grant? Why don't they do something with Sherman? What are they doing? Are they fighting an army? What is Sherman doing in August of 1863 that's leading? He's doing that little Meridian campaign for a while. But then what? Why didn't they send in Rosecrans? Good question. You know, you could say that the Battle of Chickamauga was the battle for Chattanooga. That's the spin that Rosecrans and Boynton would have said. They said that was the battle. But when, aside from Nashville, was any army ever destroyed by another army? Doesn't the army at least survive to fight another day?
Vicksburg.
Well, yeah, but then what was the consequence of that?
Opening up the Mississippi, cutting off the Trans-Mississippi.
But there still was fighting across the Mississippi
Yeah.
later in the war, right? I mean, and those, a lot of them got paroled. But we can talk, yes, yeah.
Oh, I have two totally unrelated questions.
Oh, okay,
Number one, Rosecrans, as we know, was Catholic.
yes,
Did you find anything in any of your research that his religion
heard it.
had anything to do with it? You heard it.
Uh,
Number two, we were talking at the table here, nobody else will ask it, so I'll ask it. We were wondering, is Rosecrans Road up in northern Illinois named for Rosecrans?
Yes. Yeah, okay, first, the surprising thing to me was that during the war, his religion didn't seem to hurt him. It did later in his political career, in that, you know, his brother was a bishop of Columbus, Ohio, and is buried in the cathedral there. And there's some letters back and forth. Rosecrans was known as the Great Decliner because he was offered the nomination of governor of Ohio, I think governor of California. He could have had any number of positions. And his brother writes him and said, you know, Rosecrans wasn't really a political guy, and politics was as rough in the 19th century as it is today. The surprising not during the war, I think it's because, you know, Horace Greeley was the guy that sought him out, and some of them thought, well, this may will help us with the Irish troops, you know, a lot of Irish troops from German camp. When I first got into this, I looked up every place Rosecrans, and there's probably not 10 places in America named Rosecrans. California has a lot. They have Fort Rosecrans, Rosecrans Boulevard, and Rosecrans Street in San Diego. There's a Rosecrans census-designated place up there, right near the Wisconsin border. And I looked it up just before coming down in hopes that there was more on it. But they don't have a mayor, they don't have anything. It's just a place. But it is named for it. Yeah. Yes.
But just one last comment on the, you know, Grant versus Rosecrans. I mean, there's no question that for Lincoln, at least, the Mississippi, opening up the Mississippi was part of Grant's strategy. And for better or worse, Grant was the hero. He did achieve that. I think we all do understand these days that the, you know, developing industries in the mountainous areas, Alabama, Georgia, et cetera, North Georgia, those were extremely important ultimately in winning the war. But for Lincoln, the bottom of waters. So
Well,
we can't really take it away from Grant.
we have to be careful. You know, Lincoln quotes are not as well sourced as you think. And I was corrected in a chat room by someone. You know, there's no evidence, and we have Lincoln people here. The sourcing for you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time. There's no sourcing for that. Can you believe that? There's no sourcing for that. Lincoln's.
But again, the Mississippi was a major strategic.
But what I'm saying is we'd have to sit down, you'd have to show me the citations where he said that.
Yeah, I don't care about the quotes, I just care about the strategy.
Well, except, let's go back to what Michael Bradley said. If the Atlanta campaign had begun on the other side of Chattanooga, would Atlanta have been taken? And almost everybody believes that the fall of Atlanta was the nail in the Confederacy. It's casket. Do you accept that?
I think holding on to Chattanooga, I agree with you, I think holding on to Chattanooga was really it.
Okay.
Because that was it for the industries that were being supported.
But also the route to Atlanta. Because Atlanta determined that Lincoln wasn't going to be defeated for re-election, and that was it.
Well, yeah.
But if they've got to get, let's say that Rosecrans had never left Murfreesboro, and they have to still get to Chattanooga. So this is something we would have to really sit down and look at the Lincoln things. I would tell you this. One of the things that surprised me doing this research is, and you know, this is the land of Lincoln, but Washington, D.C. is also kind of the land of Lincoln too. And as a boy growing up, and there was Lincoln, Peterson House where he died, when downtown Round, it was a real downtown, and not a place for souvenir shops for school groups and stuff like that. Although it's changing. You know, you could go shopping and here was this no lines, no tickets to get in where Lincoln died. It was like, you know, a religious site. But Lincoln really wasn't the man sitting in the chair in 1863 that we kind of grew up with. And as late as 1864, people within his party are talking about, should there be someone else? And so I think if you read my book online or in library or wherever, read the Washburn chapter. That's very important. Because they were really jockeying to see who would be the nominee in 1864. And you may know that offering Grant the lieutenant generalcy was kind of an understanding that he would not run for president. John Russell Jones is sought out, you know, they said to Lincoln, oh no, he doesn't want to be. I will also say this in defense of Grant. I think much of this was not sought by Grant. It was Washburn's doing. And I think up until 1864, all Grant wanted to do was to have a good war. So he wouldn't have to go back to the tanners business. You know, he didn't have this ambition. But then as you get closer to it, and then of course the 1868, that's a very surprising thing, is that, Lincoln isn't the strong man that we think. That he's a good man, he's a wise man, but Stanton in many ways is more powerful. Questions? Yes?
A few answers ago, you used the term running the show. Am I correct that your fundamental thesis is Stanton and the radical Republican clique were running the show, including the War Department?
Okay, let me say, yeah, kind of, but don't put it in the papers, okay? This is what I would say. And you kind of brought this up. The big question was who's going to emerge as the hero of the war and be the next president of the United States, right? Because whoever was going to be the hero of the war was going to be president. The president was Andrew Jackson and Zachary Taylor, much less George Washington. And George Washington, yes. Well, it could have been anybody. Could have been anybody. Lincoln was not going to run for a third term. There's no doubt about that, right? No one in the room thinks that Abraham Lincoln, had he lived, would have run in 1868. That was forbidden. So, it's an open thing. So all these politicians made connections. So Salmon P. Chase, he actually was a benefactor of Rosecrans to a degree. Benjamin Butler. So, you were the one that asked the question. I think, why was the Civil War fought? Was it to see who had the stronger army, who had the better strategy? It was fought for political reasons. Is that safe to say? It redid the nation. Is that safe to say? And, it changed not just for emancipation, but there was a new party that actually would, become the majority party up until the for many, many years. Before that, the Democrats had run everything, dating back to at least Andrew Jackson. So I think that played a big role. I would say go to Evan, that new book on Evan Stanton, and that will be a real eye-opener. Yes.
This is kind of backtracking a little
That's fine. I love the questions.
In the Battle of Chickamauga, if they were concerned about the left and being cut off from Chattanooga, and they knew that they were being pressed on the other side, why didn't they overnight on the 19th move the rest of the army up to Snodgrass Hill and a more defensible position?
Well, they had a draw on the 19th, right? I mean, they had repulsed everybody. Again, you're going to have to get a Chickamauga first. I can tell you this. But let's, off the top of my head, it was a 2-day battle. At the end of the first day, you still maintaining your line on the creek there, correct? So are you going to abandon the field? No. But that's what Thomas said that night. And they did move a lot of people to the left. But are you going to completely give up the right? Well, then maybe they're going to go all the way behind you. I would say they ran out of men. But you probably need to get Glenn Robertson up there to talk. Yes?
Does Rosecrans even
That's how I actually pronounce the name, yeah.
Does he actually hold Chattanooga after the battle if General Thomas doesn't hold in Chickamauga?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So let's say, okay, let's look at this. That's a really good question.
We talk about Rosecrans is rallying the troops, and the troops all love him, but he's saying, stand there and fight for me, and they're all saying, see ya, and running. Is he going to be able to hold if it wasn't for Thomas holding off the Confederates and then making a proper
So maybe
fallback?
the right decision was to go to Chattanooga. What do you think about that?
Yes. Absolutely.
Maybe the right decision was to go to Chattanooga and start the defenses, which is what he did.
There's no way they could have done it. These armies were beat up after.
That's right. See, look, I'm just going to keep invoking Dave Powell because he's, I don't know him personally, I might even disagree with him, but I communicate a little bit. I said, really, what would have been an alternative? Let's say that after the third day, the Confederates go back across, back towards Dalton. Is the Union Army going to pursue them? Remember, they haven't really been in Chattanooga. What do? They're going to go into Chattanooga. What they're going to have their wounded, they're going to have their dead, and they're going to have the creek. But guess what? They're going to give that up probably, because that's on the other side of Missionary Ridge. How many people are you going to put across Missionary Ridge to maintain a creek? You see? So Chattanooga, and what did John Russell Young say 4 times after a victory? Thomas is we got to bring in Thomas in this. Why is Thomas after Nashville? Why isn't he given a big? He was a Virginia Democrat. He's of no use to you if But listen, we can say the radicals, in a sense, were right. I mean, you want to reconstitute the Union and have a bunch of the old orders reestablished. Other questions?
Any other questions?
Virginia.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.